And therefore, without further ado, I would like to call the following people to come to the front. I would start with the moderator. Henry Minor. Mr. Henry Minor has replaced James Oranga for various reasons. He's going to moderate the session. And I would like to have him joined by our CEO, Mr. David Omoyo. And Mr. Omoyo, we would like you to come to the front. Followed by the CEO, Capital Market Authority, Mr. Paul Muthaura. We are happy to have you. And he will be followed by the Dean, School of Communication, Language and Performing Arts, Professor Levi Obonyo. And finally, but not least, we will have Vice Chair, Kenya Association of Manufacturers, Mr. Mushai Kunyiha. Again, we are happy to have you. I know we are going to have a discussion on gender, media and gender at some point, and there's an issue that's going to come up looking at the composition here. And I have to give a caveat that is not the design of the Media Council. We asked for representatives from various organizations, and they sent us these people, and therefore we have to appreciate them. Theo. So, Henry, it's your turn now to take over and moderate this session. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Leo. At least you saved me the discussion that I'm not the driver of the manual, but we all still Kenyans. We would try and cover as many of the issues as possible, but bear with us that we are not as representative. Good morning once again. My name is Henry Minor. As indicated, I'm a member of the Media Complaints Commission, but I work for an organization called Article 19 Eastern Africa. I don't know, by default, they've just picked on me to replace James Oranga, who's not here. But perhaps because I have been doing some work around development and media for some time. And so I would perhaps just like to set the process by asking a few questions or issues so that each of our panelists would take some time to give us a few opening remarks, and then we will take questions from the plenary on how some of these issues could be addressed. But I want to begin by indicating that if we were to situate the Big Four in Kenya into a regional and global thinking, that they are not strange goals that have been set, that at a continental level, the African Union, I think when we were launching the strat plan, you noticed Omoyo making reference to 2063 as a document. We've also had, at a global level, what is called Sustainable Development Goals. And I want to just pick a few of the Sustainable Development Goals so that in our framing we understand where we are. And Sustainable Goal number 1 talks about eliminating poverty. If you remember, SDGs are replacing MDGs, which had talked about halving poverty. You know, like leave half of the world poor, but if we've managed to halve that, then we would be fine. Sustainable Goal 2 is ending hunger and improving food security, nutrition, and agriculture. And I would want us to take that too and keep thinking about the Big Four as we reflect on it. Ending hunger, improving food security, nutrition, and agriculture. And Sustainable Goal 3 is ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. Ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. So at what point do we say our universal health care is going to cover everyone? Children and also the elderly. When do we say that our insurances can no longer take you as a new client? Is that going to remain the discussion in a country called Kenya? And lastly is to build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. Build resilient infrastructure. Many of us would remember just the rains. After a few months, we didn't have roads in some places. So building resilient infrastructure, not building infrastructure for the sake of it, building resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. So what is this that we would be calling sustainable industrialization? Do we understand that if we are going for fossil fuels, they are not, they are limited in nature. And so even as we discover oil and discover gas, that they can't be there forever. What can we learn from countries like Norway, who say going by today's budget, they are able to power the country for another 63 years. So if they didn't generate anything, how they've used their wealth, they are able to power their country for another 63 years. So this is the discussion. And at the center of this, can we be able to develop in secret? Can we be able to develop in secret when people don't have information except a few? When the media is not allowed to get to some of these spaces and take pictures of our big industrialization complexes, when we are not saying much about what we are innovating because we are innovating in secret, is it possible? And or how can the media ensure that if we are innovating, that they do not release the innovative secrets before we have secured them, before we have patented them, so that we can trade with them? I'm using this to remember that I know that Kiondo, which is a Kenyan Kamba largely basket, is patented in Japan. So because we developed openly, but didn't remember to patent it, somebody else passed by and created that to be their own knowledge. So I want to invite colleagues into this discussion, and I will not start by David Omoyo. I'll come to David Omoyo last. But I want to speak to the Vice Chair of Kenya Association of Manufacturers, Mr. Mushai. How do we find a relationship between manufacturers and media in Kenya, especially where it is seen that sometimes manufacturers are looking at the bottom line, regardless of the well-being of the people who work for them or who they work for in an ecosystem?
Thank you very much. First, I should start on a light note. Let me apologize for influencing the panel. The invitation was to our former chair, Flora Mutahi. Should have balanced the panel a little bit, but unfortunately for this event, she retired just 2 weeks ago from the chair. So that's why we are all men here. Maybe that's part of it. For manufacturing, I think if we think about what it is is it an industry or a sector of the economy? This is where people take something, we take X, transform it into Y, and try and sell that for a profit. It's one of the only industries where you are actually transforming things. You are creating value. Economically, that's what you call creating value, because you've taken something of a lower, is it a lower substance, whether it is coffee or something, and turned it into something else. Now, the benefit of that economically over time that has been seen everywhere across the world, in the countries we say we aspire to look like, is that is what grows economies. You've got to have that at a base somewhere where you grow economies and create wealth. Because generally, that involves a lot of investment in equipment, materials, in people as well. So I would challenge the view that we are not investing in people, because people have to have the skills to be able to transform materials from one thing to another, and a lot of time is spent on that. So in that sense, in an economy, it creates jobs, a lot of jobs. In fact, if you are trying to create mass jobs and build the economy, that is one of the areas you have to look at as manufacturing. So, like you indicate, I think the relationship with media can be on and off. We find, I would say media, I guess like all humans, we are great. When there's great news, we love it and we pump it up. But when people are in trouble, we like to dig those graves very deep and push them as deep in as possible. So we do try and we encourage our members to keep open relations with media. But like you said, there are things that you cannot tell them because it is proprietary information. But there are other things that we try and just keep your public image there. But I also want to say that our aim, eventually as manufacturers, is to improve the well-being of the entire country. Because if you're making something and selling to people, even if it's just water, if you don't have consumers who can buy that, then your business is very short-lived. So we must continue growing the economy. And for most people, when manufacturers, they invest into the market, they're investing, we have SME members as well. So we have people who, they're investing $10,000, $100,000, $100 million. It must bear fruit over time. So they are looking at it over the long run. But where we usually have challenges is competitiveness. Because what people will ask us, if it is a chair like that, they'll say, why can't I buy that chair in China where it costs a lot less? Now what builds into competitiveness? It's things like the cost of electricity, the cost of labor, the cost of just doing businesses, licenses, driving on pothole roads, etc. That adds up to the cost of doing business. So we need to be competitive globally. You've mentioned it's an open economy. So even though we are looked at like we're trying to get profit, which we are, it is about being globally competitive, not just being that we are kind of a source of money for everybody, yes.
Okay, so thanks. I would ask a few things which you will keep in your notebook and perhaps come back to them later on. Is it possible to have a country where people are highly educated, but they are cheaper labor? Is it possible to have a country where people are highly educated, but they offer cheap labor? Meaning that the cost of labor is far lower as it is in economies where people are not as highly educated? Or how do we turn around the argument about the cost of labor in such an economy? So that's a question I would like. But is there a middle ground for people who are peasant farmers, for instance, growing mangoes? Notice what Professor Kivuda has had to do, to come in and say, what is the best buying price of a mango, whether it is in season or off season, so that at a certain point, because I add value, I allow you to give me milk for free because there is glut. How do we manage that kind of thinking? So I'll want you to keep those two and ask ourselves, how do we turn ourselves into proper manufacturers as opposed to copycats? Again, in Kenya, there is this challenge that you open a shop and you notice everybody who's retiring in your neighborhood has built a shop and opened one. So who buys from who? So as we think through that, Professor Levy, I want to ask, there's been a discussion around town that perhaps we need to retire arts and think science and engineering and things that can bring money. Is it true that there is a country that can develop minus arts, media, language? Or are we missing a big chunk in this discussion when we say we want people to be engineers, innovators, but perhaps they will speak some coded language which we can't decipher, but the arts are not important? Karibu, Prof.
Thank you. I think there's a big space for the arts in any society, because we have to look at society from a holistic point of view, in terms of we see the contribution that engineering, that architecture, that the rest of the disciplines are bringing to the table of development. But I think the question of what software is it being clothed in is just as important. When you have a society that is heartless, that is so concerned in focusing on profit, that is so concerned in terms of maximizing the benefits that are going to accrue from production process, but without thinking through how we are going to be able to balance up, being fair, being considerate of the rest of the society. And I think it's in that area that the field of arts makes a critical contribution in terms of softening the hard edges of the sciences, softening the hard edges of the industry and manufacturing. But I think we also have to look at the, I come from the backdrop that we are all created and created equal. And in that, there's a deposit of a variety of talents. And so to one has been given the talent of manufacturing, of production, of design. But to another has been given the talent of music, of drawing. When we begin to focus attention on the one and not the other, what are we doing to the creative product of God in terms of exploiting what they have been, what has been deposited in them that they need to bring to the table of development? And I think it's important to lay emphasis on that other one just as much. But when we begin to look at broadly, in the fields that we tend to emphasize, say for example, engineering, to what extent does engineering rely on art and design in its work? When we start to demarcate, to pigeonhole, to place every industry, and we just look at the product, to what extent does the design work go into the manufacturing, the production of the car? And so if we don't invest in those other people, what's going to happen to, how are we going to design the car? But do the people who produce cars and manufacture need entertainment, need relaxation, opportunity to be able to just sit back and appreciate nature and all that it has? And we just have to look at society in a balanced form that we need it to be, and be able to exploit that. But I want to move a little bit also to the question of what do we see as the role of media in development, because I think to a great extent there's been so much emphasis. We tend to look at media simply as journalism, but journalism is a small component of what media is. It's the 1 o'clock news, the 4 p.m. news, the 7 p.m. news. There's so many pages of hard news that we have in the newspaper. But what are we thinking in terms of the functions of the media? And I think we're looking at this largely from the people of the South, because when you talk about Agenda 2063, Agenda 4, when you talk about SDGs, there's cognition of the divide between the societies of the North and of the South. And when you think about our notion, our perception of the place of media, to a great extent, we have simply appropriated the thinking that has evolved from the North. But to what extent, when we begin to critique the functions of the media, does it match the planting of those functions? And I want to suggest that one of the functions that we need to look at the media executing in the economies of the South, for example, is creative imagination. To what extent can we plant in the mind of our population what we want them to be, so that that stirs in them the desire to move towards that end? How can the media play that role? And so we do the news, and too often the conversation we have here is focusing largely on the news, but do the news. But what do we do with regard to other content of media that would be geared towards stirring the population to being what they ought to be? And I see the need, the function of the media being deliberately focused on creative imagination. But to do that, how are we packaging our personnel in the media houses able to do that? And I think there's been this notion that development content is boring, that is not appropriate for the media. But I think constantly that has been challenged. By the way, let me just throw this in there. Kenyan media has been so criticized for being overly political. But how do we define politics? And over the last while, we've been looking at pages on the media, and it seems that we tend to associate a politician with politics. Because sometimes if a politician is appearing in court, is that a political story or a critical or a legal question? And I think if we begin to critique that, but back to the question of the media, how can the content be geared towards inspiring the population to imagine where they can be, to stir heat on their seats so that they'll demand better from the policymakers? But related to that, I think we also need to think about what are we doing with the media itself in terms of policy formulation to put in place sufficient policies that would drive content that is geared towards creative imagination. And I'm thinking here, for example, the investment in public broadcaster. And I think those who are in policy positions, we have to invest in the public broadcaster to be able to carry out agenda items that commercial broadcasters may not be interested in because it's perceived not to be profit-oriented. And so I would really very much be interested in a conversation that looks at how is the public broadcaster capacitated in order to effectively carry out those functions. But still within the area of policy, to what extent can we stir the imagination of the public through public service announcements that would focus, for example, in the health situation on preventive health, which can easily be done by, for example, the campaign to wash your hands, to wear shoes, not to pee in public. You know, these are 1 minute, 30 seconds commercials that if we structured the policy framework, if we structured legislation to provide that media that are occupying the public space, because by virtue of broadcasting on the spectrum, they are occupying the public space, that would be mandated, required to provide this public announcement broadcast that would then stem some of the health challenges that we would otherwise face, that then would not cost the government a lot of money to be able to do this. If we ask, for example, a station to give us 30 seconds, 1 minute, usikojoe hapo, what would that do to our society?
That would be great, so long as there will be no announcement for procurement in government for it, and then it is offered for free. But we will come back to it. Professor, I think he creatively helps us to begin to understand that to develop, you need scientists and you need artists, and he is reinforcing that argument that not all of us are going to be engineers, but even where they're engineers, they need to relax so that they can think about the next slot. Mr. Mudaura, thinking about our capital markets authority and the discussion that it's shrinking, even as Kenya is thought to be doing very well. Or is that a misleading fact that has been painted by the media? Is the capital markets well covered so that the insights and the deliveries that it makes to our Kenyan economy are well known? Or is it just a club of those who have amassed as much but don't want to identify with it? So the question here is there a place of access to information proactively from the capital market so that journalists can readily cover those stories, or do they have to struggle so that they get bits of boardroom leakages that say this company is dropping off or the shareholders had insider trading, and then we think about it? Of course, I'm thinking about Uchumi and others, but I welcome you to speak to this. What is the place of media in Capital Markets Authority, and how do we link without having to wait for these leaks?
Okay, thank you for the question, incendiary as it may be. But I think maybe it's important to start with just trying to gain an understanding of what is really the function of the capital markets. Too often, when you have a conversation about the capital markets, you say that's the stock exchange. That is where these people who have large companies make and lose money on a daily basis. But at its fundamental core, the purpose of the capital markets is, one, to incentivize a saving culture over consumption. And where those savings, where there are those savings, then provide them with opportunities for investment, for return in the long term. We often have, every day when you watch the news, they introduced the section on the capital markets with the phrase, and now the money markets, which is actually a misnomer, because the money markets are the short-term end, the 0 to 365 days. 1 year or less is money markets, which is really the banking space. And that is looking at, the turnover of activity, its cash flow, versus the capital markets, which are looking at long-term investments, which are looking at how do we trigger wealth creation? How do you support economic transformation? Because as Mushai put it, unless companies are able to grow, are able to produce more, then they're not able to employ, they're not able to generate more tax revenue, they're not able to create new opportunities for a value chain of suppliers to participate in that space. But that said, then you have the question of, okay, are the capital markets shrinking? One, the very fact that you can open a newspaper every day and know how big or small the capital markets are, that's a huge positive factor. That is the pursuit of transparency as to the underlying wealth or value creation in these companies. We often say to companies who are considering listing, it is actually the cheapest form of advertising you can ever have, because your name will be in the newspaper every single day without you doing anything, because they have to indicate your market capitalization, how many shares traded, and often what is your value proposition. Now, we have gone through, I think it's important to accept that the markets are very strong reflection of, so when you look at by virtue of the capital markets, one, the stock exchange is only one component of the opportunities that exist in the capital markets. The trading, buying and selling of shares is just only one of the options. You have bonds, you have derivatives, you have real estate products, you have collective investment scheme products. You have an ever-growing pool, especially when you talk of the SDGs. There are new opportunities in sustainable finance that are being created every day. There are opportunities in Islamic finance, in green finance. So we also need to work closer with the media, and we're very glad to note we're already in partnership with the Media Council to try and help build awareness on the true spectrum of the opportunities that are there in the capital markets. And the markets are about democratizing wealth. To set up a multi-billion shilling company is often beyond the capacity or means of any one individual. But by virtue of having those shares traded, you create an opportunity for every Kenyan, your stakeholders, to have an opportunity to own a part of the companies they're investing in. Every day you buy a product, you're investing in someone. So how do you make sure you also get a return on their growth? We tend to look at buying of shares as, when is there going to be an IPO? But that's only the point at which the company is raising money. But post the IPO, that company is trading every day. As you say, there are some days the market goes down. That's a prime opportunity to buy that share so that when it goes up, your wealth is created. Our media very often talks of the loss in value that comes from the dropping of share values rather than the opportunity that's coming. Right now, we have very substantially undervalued shares. Many of our, when you have a moment of market decline, that is when everywhere else in the world, the markets boom because everyone can see the fundamental opportunity. But that is tied to information, and your very valid point. How do we make sure people understand the underlying fundamentals of the company to know that, yes, they're actually undervalued right now and there's an opportunity? That their share price is coming down because of wider market fundamentals, not the realities of the operations of that company. So it's good to invest because when the wider economic environment adjusts, when interest rates stabilize, when wider contextual issues that support manufacturing, that support the financial sector improve, then that value will rise. That is why we work with partners like the Media Council. Just 2 months ago, we had a joint session with the Media Council as well as the ACCA, the Association of Chartered Accountants, to sensitize the journalists. And thank you for clarifying, it's not the media. Journalists, let us not capture you all in one grand statement. Sensitize journalists about what is happening in the capital markets, what are the scope of products, what are the opportunities, and what is their role. You know, in an increasingly integrated world, we have to accept that our sensational story that's going to sell our paper in Kenya is actually the story that will be seen within seconds in every corner of the world.
Okay.
So we ask ourselves, why aren't our markets growing? Because you tell the world every day that the country is in decline, companies are underperforming, that there is scandal in every corner. So why is everyone going to invest in that environment? So we need to understand the fundamental link between the message we put out in the world and how people respond to that message.
So thanks for those opening remarks. I think as to the other colleagues, I'll pack 1 or 2 questions for you. Our market fundamentals right, so that the media and journalists can always be positive. And is it necessarily wrong to say things when they are wrong? So I would like us to keep reflecting on this. And can a country that has a single narrative, everything is booming, be the right country that we want? Or should we have a country that has multiple narratives, so long as those narratives are informed by facts? Because I tend to think that whenever a negative story is covered, especially from the capital markets, the media is vilified for being sensational. But 2 or 3 years down the line, facts emerge and prove that the media was right. And nobody comes back to say, we were the ones who were sensational. The media was right. So there is this thinking. But what I appreciate from your comments is, how do we partner? How do we generate a pool of journalists and media engagement processes where all of us are engaging from a point of information and knowledge, and we share information in good faith, so that people are not looking for the leaks? Because when you have no facts available or information available, you make a narrative depending on the few leaks that came your way. So as we think about that, I will not get to Omoyo for now. I want to have him have some time to think through this. But to, again, just reiterate to the Chief of Staff of the President and Head of Presidential Delivery Unit, that I began by pointing out that the Big Four are situated in a regional thinking at AU level, 2063, at the UN level, SDGs. And I was able to show that, one, of course, Kenya was quite helpful in the development and agreement of SDGs. So the Big Four are an extraction of the SDGs, especially if you are looking at SDG 1, SDG 2, SDG 3, and 9. But my point here is, the President has clearly indicated that we want as much information to be out there. Is the information available about the Big Four in formats, in standards that can be understood by the media, by journalists, to be able to help write the stories? Or is it a single narrative again, coming from Nzioka? He wants this story on housing to be this way. And therefore, we don't get to question, we don't see alternatives coming up. But we want to welcome you to this session, knowing that for us, the media has a big place. The media is the space that can be utilized to help galvanize citizens into this second transformation that we are all gearing up to. So karibu, and happy to listen to you, and then we'll come back to the question sessions after you've made your remarks. Karibu Nzioka.
To the board of the Media Council, the leadership of the Media Council, all the guests, colleagues from the Fourth Estate and the Fifth Estate, citizen journalists who are all here. Good morning to all of you. I think now it's good afternoon. First of all, my apologies. Believe it or not, I was in Nyamakima having a similar discussion with the small business community there, because they also want to understand their role and the role they want to play in the Big Four, and what the government is going to do for 90% of the business community in this country, which is small and micro enterprise. So, ladies and gentlemen, there's two ways we can take this. I have a very nice speech, a very, very, very nice speech. I have read it and I'm actually impressed by it. But it's not a story that is told in my own words. So I can read this, or I can just tell you a short story that allows us to go back to the panel and we have more of an interactive session. So which one do you have, this, or I have the short story? Okay. So I'm always cautious about engagement with the Fourth Estate, because there is a natural tension that exists between government and the Fourth Estate. And typically that tension is characterized it manifests itself at different times, either as adversarial, or as accusatory, or as opportunistic on both sides. And that tension is very healthy, because it keeps everyone in check. And for the Fourth Estate, that natural skepticism, curiosity, and critique is also what keeps government on its toes. So I'm always happy to be in a situation where there is a healthy tension that exists. However, that tension can become unhealthy when it moves away from disagreements of principle into issues touching on outright fabrication of facts and misinformation. And that is usually a product of scarcity. As you had very accurately pointed out, that why would I speculate on a story if I had the information? If I had the information, I would write it. But because I don't have the information, I am left to fill those gaps myself. And that's where we find ourselves today on the topic of the Big Four. So the Big Four, as has been pointed out, is an amalgamation of thinking that involves an interesting platform. One is we have our 30-year blueprint, which is the Vision 2030, which sets the high-level aspiration of where we want to go as a country. But that vision is broken down into tactical implementation plans, which in government we refer to as the medium-term plan. So you have MTP1 under President Kibaki, you have MTP2 under President Uhuru in his first term, and you now have MTP3, which is now President Kenyatta's second term. Now, MTP3 is the Big Four. The Big Four is MTP3, because what we've done is to accelerate the key issues. What do people want to see? They want to see jobs. They want to see a step change in the economic growth. They want to see stability in terms of consistency in the economy. They would like to see more value to trickle down to more people. And they would most importantly, they want a social environment that allows them to focus on other activities. So you don't want families preoccupied with the burden of healthcare, because that can cripple an entire family and its extension. If you have one person in the family who is suffering a chronic disease, that can actually bankrupt an entire family. And these are the challenges we have to confront today. And that is what has underpinned the focus on those four issues. One, affordable housing for a cadre of citizens that has no access to that housing. So this is looking at social housing for those paying anything between 1,000 shillings to 1,500 to 15,000 shillings, who sit within the social component. You then have affordable housing, which are those people who can afford to pay over 15,000 shillings, maybe to about 25 or 30. And then you have over that to what we call those who are paying rents or able to afford mortgages of monthly mortgages in excess of 50, 60,000 shillings. That bit is called the mortgage gap. Our address as government on housing is to really focus on social housing and affordable housing. Today, as we speak, there is a deficit of homes, affordable homes. There's many houses, but there's very few affordable homes. And we have a market distortion in our mortgage sector that does not allow ordinary people to go take out a mortgage at commercial rate and actually make your rent pay for the mortgage. Mortgage cost is typically now a factor of almost 3 times your rental value of your property, if you are lucky. In some instances, it goes up to 6 times. So there's a level of corrections that need to happen across the housing chain. That's one. 2 is the aspiration to affordable healthcare, to remove what we call the financial risk to households posed by one incident. Everything can be going well, you have a stable family, everything is moving okay, you can make ends meet, then one catastrophe happens. And all of a sudden, you have to dig into your savings, you have to go into fundraising mode. The complexity of the disease may require overseas treatment. You realize even the covers that are afforded even by private or public insurance facilities do not cover the need. And that, unfortunately, is where the bulk of our people sit as a nation. The vision and the aspiration on universal health care and universal health coverage is to really make that financial risk as small as possible to as many people in the country. Third is the issue of food security and nutrition. For most, this is an abstract issue, but if I were to break it down for you into its simplest components, 14 million people in the country are food insecure. So it means they don't have consistent access to affordable food, staple food, for them to live their lives, whether they are in the urban marginalized areas living in the slums, or whether they are in marginal parts of the country, arid or semi-arid. They all have challenges of access to good quality nutrition at an affordable rate on a consistent basis. You then have 4 million Kenyans who are vulnerable, completely vulnerable. They are actually dependent on interventions by the state to have access to a regular nutrition. So the aspiration on food security is to bridge that gap. So for us to improve productivity of our staples, diversify our staples, become food secure as a nation in terms of our strategic reserve of food, not strategic reserve of maize, strategic reserve of food, because man must live on more than maize alone. And this is a philosophy that will need to become inculcated in the citizenry. You have the issues touching on productivity. Many of us here dabble in farming. Who here is a telephone farmer? By a show of hands. Who has a small plot somewhere? They have a few cabbages, they have a cow here, they keep calling home and saying, umefanya hii, umenunua hii ng'ombe. How many of you, just by a show, let's be honest. We are all of us here. None of you are telephone farmers, in whatever, even if it's 10 chickens. You know, telephone farming, contrary to popular belief, can actually be a gainful income earner, not a distraction. It can be a gainful income earner. And the challenge for the government is to be able to help farming farmers earn more for the money, have access to better quality inputs, things like seed quality, things like the right manure for the right soils, access to markets, you know. Everyone, you know, I recall very much the famous quail phase that we went through as a nation. And everyone was convinced that they should be keeping quails. But people didn't quite look at the market, the offtake side of things. It was not a bad thing to keep quails. I'm sure at a point there was a need, but the hysteria sort of oversupplied the market. But the biggest challenges we face, particularly those who do like small greenhouse investment. People go take 150,000, do a small greenhouse, put your little drip, you plant nyanya. If you don't sell the tomato within a day of harvesting from a greenhouse, you know what happens. You throw away all of that. And unfortunately, that's where the bulk of our subsistence farmers sit. So you have post-harvest losses occasioned by poor access to market, by poor cold chain infrastructure, by underinvestment in infrastructure to those areas. You have education gaps in terms of linking what you're growing to what the market requires. So there's a whole journey happening around optimizing our food security that the Ministry of Agriculture and its enabling ministries is working very hard. Water security. You know, how many people can afford to drill a borehole? It's a very select group of people. It's very expensive. How many people have access to seasonal rivers? Very few people. How many people have access to permanent water sources? Very few people. So what happens in the interim? Because we know that rain-fed agriculture is a thing of the past. Access to water ponds, small dams, you know, you start hearing more of this, similar to what has happened in transformative economies like India, where just giving somebody access to 100 cubic meters of water allows them to improve the productivity in a half acre by 10 times, because they have water throughout dry period waiting for the next rains to come. Those are some of the conversations you start hearing under the food security and nutrition. The last issue is growing the manufacturing contribution from currently around 8.4 to 15% in the remaining 4 years of the president's term. That actually requires a year-on-year growth of 20%. That has not happened before, ever. So the aspiration to move our manufacturing-based contribution to 15% requires a completely out-of-the-box approach to doing things. Some of the steps you've already seen happening in terms of dealing with systemic failures on illicit trade, which is a big contributor to suppression of growth within our manufacturing sector. The next is cost of inputs like energy, which we are now trying to address. That's a big challenge for us. The next is access to markets for finished products, whether within the East African region, domestically within Kenya, or overseas to markets like the AGOA environment. The whole essence of manufacturing is to get our trading community, both domestically and internationally, functioning well, which is why I was in Nyamakima, incidentally, because the bulk of our small traders, and bulk of the people who power our business community are small traders, people who trade in goods. But these people want to grow. They want to move from doing reja business into doing big wholesale business. Some even want to aspire to being small manufacturers. In a way, that has happened over time. Many of you can be told stories of people who used to had small shops in River Road, and eventually they moved to Babadogo and they opened small go-downs and they started producing things at scale. But those stories are few and they've reduced because we opened up our borders to goods that really ought to have been produced here at home. And it's that reflection that is happening now for us to have a radical shift in how we approach business, how we approach trade. And for all the things that have been said about the approach that a certain country that I won't name has taken in terms of putting their national interest first. You know, there is a president who says, my country first. He has renegotiated tariffs across the world. He has overturned trading relationships between continents. But what is he doing? He is first and foremost trying to give his own base a chance to grow their businesses and to reclaim some of the market that they lost to other jurisdictions. The situation here is not going to be so much different, because for us to grow Kenyan businesses, of necessity, we need to protect them. And we need to protect them very cleverly in an environment where we are signatories to international treaties, where we are part of a global community. I don't know if any of you have been attending the Trade Week. You will see that there has to be a balance between what we produce in Kenya, what we import, the fact that we are sort of struggling to push our products into regional markets because there's questions arising about origin, whether this product was actually produced in Kenya. So it's just getting these things right so that we can move to that 15%. In real terms, 15% means jobs, jobs, jobs. That's what it means, and that's what it will boil down into. Now, this Big Four sits on it sits on a platform. Just the way I'm standing here, the Big Four sits on a platform of enablers. We must get the governance environment correct. So issues of depoliticizing the environment, very critical. Issues of reducing political tension in the country are necessary prerequisites to development. Dealing with corruption, confronting good governance, procurement issues, value for money question, because at the end of the day, the government remains the biggest spender in the economy. Trying to get that right is a journey in and of itself, but it's a necessary enabler for us to achieve this vision. Security. It goes without saying, if people don't feel safe, they will not be productive. I don't need to expound on that anymore. Productivity is the next issue. How many of you are paid per hour? That's 2 people. You're very lucky. Because it means if you put on more hours, you get more money. Most Kenyans will wake up in the morning and be paid at the end of the month, whether or not they go to work, whether or not when they sit in the office, they have an output that is measurable. So ask yourself, when you open a textile factory in Athi River to stitch clothes for Calvin Klein because you've got a contract in Washington, and the people in your factory can only produce 60 garments per stitcher per day, you're competing for the same market with a factory in Sri Lanka or Bangladesh, where each stitcher is doing an average 140 to 150 garments a day, because that person is paid per garment. In Kenya, we pay you at the end of the month, your minimum wage is guaranteed, there is no correlation between your pay and your productivity. I'll leave you to think about that. It's not always the easiest conversation to have. At times it's diametrically opposed to the outcomes that the unions would want, but even the unions would like to see more money going to employees. Even employers like FKE would like to see more productivity. So it's just a question of finding the sweet spot that works for everyone. Education. We have a proclivity to focus all our attention on graduate programs, degree programs, and advancing ourselves. But how many of you are sitting with graduates at home? How many of you know graduates, people holding degrees, not just any degrees, quality degrees, and they're sitting at home? How many of you? Everyone in here, don't lie, everybody here has a challenge to tafutie. And in a lot of cases, people are willing to settle even for jobs that have no correlation to what they've studied. And somewhere along the way, we buckled to the pressure to convert polytechnics into universities. It was a catastrophic mistake for the country. And catastrophic because today, the plumber, if you have a plumber in your local estate, that plumber is a boss. That plumber, you call him, and he'll tell you, Leo, I can't come, niko kwa fulani, I'm trying to do this thing. Because there are no plumbers. And you'll only trust the plumber who come and do the job once. So you're not going to just call anyone. You say, that guy is the guy I want. And that's where we are, because we stopped producing those people. If you ask that plumber where he was trained, chances are he was trained on Haile Selassie Road at the Polytechnic, or went to a village polytechnic in their home county. But we did away with those institutions, convinced everyone that they ought to be a graduate, but the reality is the economy for white-collar jobs is shrinking. Conversely, the economy for blue-collar jobs is growing, but there's nothing to feed the supply chain. And these are stories that really I want you to understand, so that when you see these debates around technical vocational training is an inferior form of education, which is what people were convinced. But the reality is, technical vocational training is the most suited form of education for a country that is looking to leapfrog. Now, which countries have built their economy on the back of vocational training? If anyone can tell me one, and you'll be very shocked. And we buy all their products, and we say that everything they produce is built to the best precision in the world. Germany. Most of the people you see running huge companies in Germany all started as apprentices that came out of vocational training institutions, got jobs within months or even while they were in training, then decided to pursue further refinement of their courses, maybe management or specialization or deeper engineering programs, once they were employed. But at no point were they left alone, because the market was hungry. A market that is looking to industrialize and is working on manufacturing requires blue-collar people. How many of you, like the ladies, why do you keep going back to the same stylist or hairdresser? And why are they so rare? And how is it possible that a stylist can walk out of, 3 people can walk out of an employer and shut down a salon and move to another salon down the road to another employer? Am I lying? How many of you say, oh, I'm following my hairdresser because he's moved from here to another place? Because they're not there. But who is training these people? Where did the dignity, where did it become indignified to be a hairdresser, to be a cook, to be a plumber, to be an electrician, to be somebody who cuts glass, to be a mason, to be a joiner? Why did we criminalize these jobs and make them look like they're so low, yet we know we all need them, and we know those people do a very valuable job for the country? So vocational training, for us, we see as a huge, huge enabler. And the government has put the money where its mouth is, which is why now you have 65 new TVETs operational out of the 130 that are under construction. These TVETs, the curricula is industry-driven. So it is designed by people like Volkswagen, who are now manufacturing in Thika. We are talking to people like Tullow Petroleum to help us define what it is they need in terms of the skill set, what your kazi ya mkono for the pipeline that will be built. We are talking to the maritime sector, people like Maersk and others, to help us restart what we were doing so well in places like Bandari College. That enabler is mission critical. The next enabler is the cost of energy. This is a debate that I would love to go into, but so far the indicators are just not going in the right direction. And it's something that causes us huge concern, because we would like to see realistically the power for domestic consumers and industrial consumers to be lower without the need for heavy government subsidy. And it's a path that we have to figure out how we are going to get there. And we need to reinvent the way in which our energy sector has been functioning. The last enabler is technology. How do we leverage technology to increase the reach of one doctor? Because to train a doctor takes a long time. Even if we employ all the, I keep being bombarded that we brought Cuban doctors, yet we have 1,200 doctors who are sitting at home and we haven't employed them. We do need to employ those 1,200 doctors at some point. It's very important. But the reality is, even if you employed all those doctors, you are still at a doctor-patient ratio of 1 to 15,000, which means one doctor sees an entire location by himself. So how do you make that doctor have reach? How do you multiply their efficacy? How does this doctor, to stop him from having to refer you to a level 4 or level 5 hospital from a local hospital in your village, he needs access to technology. He needs to be able to take your x-ray and send it somewhere, and that person tells him, check this, that, and the other. They need to be able to do some basic diagnostics that stops you as a patient from being sent 30 or 40 kilometers away to a county hospital when your issues can be addressed at home. Those can only be done by technology. We have a population growing. By the time we get to 2022, the estimate is that you have a population of easily maybe about 50, 51 million people. And it is anecdotal because, we still need to do a census, and the census is coming, I think, 2019, or starting this year, or towards the end of this year. But having said that, in a country that will have 51 million people, you will still, by 2022, not have more than 130,000 policemen. So how do you improve the reach of each policeman? How do we remove the frustration of each police officer? Because it's not that police officers don't want to serve you. They want to serve you, but they're limited in terms of their numbers. It's limited in terms of basic access to information technology that will make their work a lot easier. Having increased non-personalized surveillance, having more helicopters, having more scanning equipment, having more channels to receive information from citizens. These are the ways in which we can help to improve the efficacy of a very, of a strained service that has to deliver both resolving criminal issues, but also dealing with, pedestrian issues. If you're in town and you're lost and you see a policeman, you should be able to walk up to them and say, I need to go somewhere, can you direct me? In a lot of countries, that's what happens. You shouldn't be scared of going to talk to an officer. And that's the journey that we are coming. Those are the key enablers, and that's why we see technology as being very critical. Now, having said that, what is the role of the media? And I want to wrap up because I can see the look. What is the role of the media? Number one, as government, I just want to assure you that we were waiting for the budget process to end. We have been doing an exercise of alignment, because you have to align this vision with the resource envelope. The resource envelope is a finite resource envelope. We know how much we can generate domestically, we know how much we can borrow and within what limits we can borrow, and we know what can be applied, we know what needs to go down to the counties, we know what needs to go down to independent institutions and other arms of government. So we have to align this aspiration and the activities that need to be undertaken to the money that is there. We have now completed the first phase of that. We will then be releasing public information. So this cluster on food security, what will it be doing? What should Kenyans expect? What is it that we will measure this administration on? That will be made public. The housing aspiration, beyond telling us 500,000 homes, where are these homes? How will we get there? Who is going to do it? How, when will it be done? And by, what are the situations? How much will it cost? That will be made public. These policies on manufacturing, where are they? Can we see them? Sorry. Can we see those policies? Can they be made public? Can we know how to access and benefit, irrespective of where you sit in the business, whether you're a small business, a big manufacturer, a trader, or an importer, where do you fit? If you want to bring in investors, many people want to bring in foreign investors, yet there's a lot of money sitting here, things like that. You want that information. Healthcare. What should I expect as a citizen? When you tell me universal healthcare, what does it mean to me? Does it mean I'll need to go to a hospital and be treated for free? If not, can you be very clear as a government what that will mean to me? That information is what we are packaging, is what you'll see reflected in the programs and projects of ministries, is what you'll see in terms of policy, because significant portion of this will be undertaken. Actually, 90% of this is private sector led. Government must be really the key enabler to that. What we would then ask the media when we've done that is to give fair coverage, to ask the questions that ought to be asked, to hold the government accountable, to showcase both the good and the bad in equal measure, to paint a picture that gives a sense of pride for Kenyans to be Kenyans. And that for me is something I really, particularly our younger demographic in the fourth estate. As a government, we need to make you feel proud of being Kenyan, but more importantly, you also need to help us, because this thing becomes self-perpetuating. When we ban ourselves every time in the paper, it gets into the psyche of the citizen that nothing is working. Everything is doom and gloom. We need to sort of break that cycle and give context to the bad, but also give prominence to the good. I know bad news sells better, but even the good news you can put on page 2, so that people can see it. Ladies and gentlemen, let me leave that there. I can see the cautionary message here. And it would be nice to take 1 or 2 questions on this, and hopefully have a useful and enriching discussion. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Nzioka, for those remarks and for the dedication. I think I'll only open the session to questions, 3 or 4 questions. Please keep your questions brief, no alternative presentation from you. So keep the question. If you can direct the question to a specific panelist, that would help. Colleagues, let's have the mics roving. So the first 3 questions.
Okay.
Yes.
Morning. My name is Shitsukane. I have a question for Nzioka. I really liked your presentation, but my question is, because I'm in business, yeah? And you mentioned, there was a few words you mentioned, opening borders, and you also said something about protecting people like me, SMEs. So opening borders, was it a good idea? That is one question, because it seems a bit unfair for somebody like me. If I'm to open a business, I've got so many taxes and licenses to pay. How do I compete competitively with guys who come with this Can Invest program, who get, is it 10 years of not paying so many things? Yeah, how do I have a competitive edge against people like that? Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Nzioka, for your wonderful presentation, I'll call it. My question could not be media related, but I'll just like to ask, because this is a good opportunity for me to try and understand. Towards the implementation of the Big Four agenda, I believe we are going to task, because Kenya, we have this devolved system of governance, so I believe we are going to task our county governments in helping to implement the Big Four agenda. We all sort of know and see how the county governments are running their programs, how do you really plan to hold them accountable to see the realization of this Big Four agenda, because they are really critical? Thank you.
Your name, madam?
My name is Lorna.
Lorna. Okay, thank you, Lorna.
Thank you very much. My name is Edward Kusawa, part-time lecturer at St. Paul's. The discussion around competitiveness is extremely important, but my thinking has been, how do we increase our competitiveness? Only if we can have world-class infrastructure, world-class institutions, world-class schools, world-class health. It's like in Dubai. It has been in my thinking for some season. The only way we can be competitive is to have those world-class institutions and infrastructure in place to reduce inefficiencies. We have inefficiencies. For example, corruption is one of those inefficiencies. Infrastructure is another part of those inefficiencies. And I've always asked myself, we had an opportunity to be a world-class country because in the past we were a world-class country. The other thing is, how do we accelerate being world-class? I mean, when you speak about the cost of energy, for example, Nzioka, I think we could have a discussion around that for a very long time, because I know that we have an overcapacity, and that's a debate. And I don't know why still we have problems around that. So how do we make ourselves world-class? Like Dubai, they build themselves on trade and housing, real estate, and see they've been able to attract trade. So they're a trade hub, they're a financial hub, they're an economic hub. We had all those advantages being world-class. Could we make sure that we don't have schools that don't have resources? That's the only way we can be competitive. Otherwise, this competitive
Thanks,
becomes
Edward.
something.
The question is met. Lastly, the gentleman at your...
Thank you, and I want to congratulate the organizers of this forum, particularly this summit. My name is Samuel Wambugo Wagithaiga. My question is on one, I don't know whether I'll focus on Mr. White, particularly on delivery. The challenge is one. How is the government going to come up with a mechanism of removing those naive and weird mechanism of loyalty towards service delivery? Again, how will we overcome this challenge, particularly on this issue related to justice, the perceived justice systems, which to me is the theme. At some point, there is competition between the legislature, the executive, and even now, then the legislature, even at parliament level. Reasons being that when you talk about also assessing or re-evaluating our policy framework, with this cancerous political scene we are seeing in, anything you are touching is perceived negatively. At what level will we come up with the positive mechanism? Finally.
Sawa, Samuel. Swali moja tu tafadhali. Asante.
Ninashukuru.
Asante, shukran.
Hii moja ni burning kidogo.
Asante. If it were burning, you will have started with that one, Samuel. So that is part of the Kenyan challenge. So the solution you are looking for can begin in us all being disciplined, so that we allow all and everyone to exist. But I think there are largely two questions. One from Shitsukane, which is about what do we do in the issue of opening borders, and how do we protect SMEs when we are allowing perhaps tax incentives to others, or grace periods for others who are from out. And two, from Lorna, the question on how do we task the devolved governments to deliver on this, but how may we hold them accountable even as we take that challenge? Edward, I think, reiterated the issue of competitiveness and how are we going to make ourselves world-class in a number of areas by reducing inefficiencies. Wambugu is talking about perhaps the negative competition between government arms and how the negative politics perhaps hampers processes moving forward. So I'll let Nzioka start, and then perhaps each one of us can chime in and see if there's a comment we could make from this. Just pick a mic before you and keep the response brief.
Thank you. Chitsuka, Shitsukane. Have I got it right? Fantastic. You know, trade is a double-edged sword. For us to open up markets for you to send your goods to Nigeria, you must be able to. It's a road, you know. It's a road which has going and coming. So we have to open up for Nigerian goods to come into Kenya. Now the challenge for us is to make you competitive. The reality is we face many challenges. For small businesses, multiplicity of licensing, your single business permit in Nairobi, and if you need to move things to Kisumu, you have to pay multiple times to move your goods around. You have multiple regulatory authorities that you need to engage. So that ease of doing business is a specific agenda that we are taking to try and remove the multiplicity of licensing and the time it takes. The issue of investors getting unfair advantage. The SEZ environment is slightly different. The SEZ, for you to qualify to be in an SEZ, there's an investment threshold that runs into hundreds of millions of shillings. And that investment threshold is conditional upon that person coming to Kenya, establishing factories or an industry, employing Kenyans, and producing a product that can be marked as having been produced in Kenya. So I don't think it's necessarily a peer-to-peer competition with SME directly. Where we are seeing real challenges with SME is when we have foreigners who come in, and those foreigners are vertically integrated. So those foreigners have access to their home markets for wholesale goods, and then they come to Kenya to do retail. So they jump into Kenya and you find them, like where I was in Yamakima, that was a big issue. They are saying, we are buying these things from Guangzhou. But now the factory in Guangzhou has sent traders to River Road. So they've cut us out of the loop completely. And now, that person for us is not an investor. Huyu amekuja kutuharibia maneno. And that one we want to deal with it because it was never envisaged. Because we would never be allowed to do the same thing in those countries. And we should take no shame, in protecting you from that sort. But nothing stops that person from coming to Babadogo or to Lunga Lunga Road and opening a factory. So I think that's one issue. The SEZ environment, by the way, it's written, it's down. If you go onto the Ken Invest website, you'll see how to qualify there. Maybe your situation may be one of partnering, looking for funding to see whether you can qualify to move into that environment. Lona, you are so right about the issues touching on devolution, because the last mile for agriculture is the county. The last mile for health service provision is the county. But one of the big things that has changed post the election is the relationship between national government and county government has changed significantly. And we have invested very heavily in building a collegial relationship with the Council of Governors, because we want to empower them to do their constitutional duty, which helps us to achieve our policy objectives. There are issues of gaps in between, and I'll give you one very simple example. We have kept 7% of the national budget to health. Out of that 7%, almost all of it will be devolved to the counties. When that money goes to the counties, it is not protected. So the MCAs can vote to reallocate those funds to other priorities. So you find that the aspiration to increase spending on healthcare may not be implemented at the county level because the county legislation, or rather the PFM Act, does not protect this money right down to the point of inflection. So it's challenges we have recognized and we are dealing with. A lot of the other programs are going through what we call conditional grant. So we'll give the county a conditional grant. They'll take the money, but with the money follows the responsibilities. And they must now execute as per the conditions of those grants. So I think it's a difficult journey, but it's one that is achievable because we feel there is a lot of goodwill at the counties to come to this conclusion. The bureaucracy, we'll have to deal with it as we go along. Edward, I can't agree more, but I think that question was directed more to my colleague. Simon, you know, tension between institutions is what we signed up for in Kenya. You know, we should be very proud of the democratic system that we have in this country, because it is only in Kenya where we can say the things that we say, and we are still growing at 6%. These countries which you're all admiring and saying they've done this and this, go and say the things you're saying in those countries. That place which you are telling us about, where they have built their things on real estate and stuff, go and say the things you are saying here, there, and see what will happen. So in Kenya, we have to live that we have an open and free society. We have a democratic society, but it's a maturing democratic. So there's tension between institutions. We are still trying to find our balance. Remember, we are only 8 years in. We're only 8 years in. So at some point, we will know where one person's power stops and starts, another one begins, and that is really a factor of us participating actively in the decision-making of democracy. So don't be asleep when elections are being held or when public consultations are being done. It's very important that you be part and parcel of that maturity process. For me, I think the tension with the judiciary, I read it very interestingly. As an advisor to the president, I was, of course, very saddened by the ruling that was made after the August 8th election. It was very sad for us who went and we did whatever we could do, because we knew we did everything in our power to talk to the people. We knew what we did was correct. But we knew that the judiciary has made a ruling and it has to be respected. And we went for another election. Were we happy? No. Did we respect it? Yes. But what has been the dividend? And I think Paul can attest to this. The level of confidence that there is in this country from external viewers is so high, because they said, for you to survive what happened as a democracy on September, it was August, when was that ruling? Was it August 31st? Or August, it was just, or September 1. When was it? I'll never forget, because I was in hospital. So I watched it when I was in my hospital bed. But I'll never forget that day, because as a country, not only did we survive, we have thrived and we have come out of it stronger. And we are still talking to each other irrespective of where we come from. That in itself is something that should be celebrated. Will there be tension? Yes. Is it bad for us? No.
Thanks, Nzioka. For Moyo, I think as you make some closing remarks, misinformation is a factor of ignorance. Disinformation is a process where willfully people generate sets of information for purposes of turning a decision that would have gone one way to the other side. Fake news is an amalgamation of those two terms used conveniently, where people think they haven't been given a fair chance, and therefore nowadays it's the easiest term you throw around, that everything is fake news. How do we arrive at a process where the country can be inoculated from disinformation but still have multiple narratives, because there isn't a single narrative? So Omoyo, as you speak to the other questions, please speak to this, because that's the biggest animal in the house, where anytime you have a different narrative, you are seen to be perhaps a propagator of fake news.
Thank you. When you are hoping to be the first to speak and you're made the very last one to speak, by this time your mind is very probably spinning. So I have to do a general collection of what I intended and try to talk to what has come up. Yes, the challenge of misinformation. From where I sit, I have a position that everybody wants to control the narrative. I usually say very openly that every government would want something said about it, and you will not want something to be said about you. I spent many years of my professional career as a communications guy for the Catholic Church, and there is always what investment in what has to be said and what cannot be said. That's why the largest arm of the Vatican is called propaganda fide. You know, trying to influence people to make decisions and all that. It's not propaganda in the sense that we take it here. When you look at the media as the fourth estate, it is the fourth estate because it is ideally the representative of the people. And in the context of the Big Four, talking directly to what Mr. Nzioka spoke about, initially I wanted to tell him that the questions in the minds of journalists now is when you mention manufacturing, the question is the traditional 5 W's and H. What do you want to manufacture? When do you want to manufacture it? Who is going to manufacture it for who? And then how is it being manufactured? Because if you walk around and talk about the Big Four agenda, without breaking it down, it becomes, if you want to build a house, how many houses, for who will build the houses and all that. So when that fails to be available, and that information is not available, you know, the newspaper will be published every day anyway. Whether, for example, if a journalist sent a question to my brother Moderator here or Nzioka, and the questions were not answered, we will not have a blank page 2. The news will go out. And what then that is, and I want to talk directly to fake news in mainstream media, is that now we end up with rumors. He did not reply to our questions, but sources close to the president intimated to the writer and all that. Isn't that true? What happens is that, number one, is there is no information flowing, either justified because we are, for example, asking, tell us, what are you manufacturing, when and where? And he knows that this blueprint, Ejapitia cabinet, we cannot publicize it. So he says, well, they can wait for a while. The media is not always patient. Then now that fake news starts proceeding. Then the next day he says, no, the media is engaging in fake news. That's how the cycle happens. Eventually find that we have literally a standstill. People suspect each other. Some guys, we have a few cases where certain very senior government officials and representatives, here there is media at the door, they sneak. Kila ofisi ya serikali, kuna kamlango kanyuma kakutoroka. Either because you are not ready to provide the information, or the information available is not very good. As I said, everybody wants to control the narrative. So principally at this level, I think, make sure there is as much information available as possible. And number two, going directly to what we're speaking about, invest also in information and media work as a function and as an enabler of the Big Four. If you want to build houses for people down in Kakamega and they are not aware that you're building houses, and they have not been told about it, they just read something in English there, and there was a house, and there was Kakamega. They don't remember really whether it was a greenhouse or a house to move in. Naturally, rumors will start swelling in, and that's what eventually gives rise to fake news. So I would like to urge, and I really appreciate that we have these conversations are going on, and as Nzioka Waita rightly says, there is healthy tension. If we become too close, then the media will not ask questions, because if he says we're going to construct 500,000 houses, by the end of the second year, the media will say, 2 years down the line, we have 20,000 houses. We are not sure whether the country will hit the target, isn't it? Those questions will not be very pleasant to him, but it's because the media is exercising their watchdog role. I usually tell journalists all the time that I meet them, I did this yesterday morning, that the work of the media is to hold those in power to account. If you are a journalist and you are defending those in power, then you should have a little soul searching, because those in power are already in power anyway. The guys being served are the ones who need that service. I know Henry wants me to...
Thanks, I'll pass to Paul, but let him speak to the reserved question that we had, but also how do we move forward? How do we have this proactive disclosure of information? Because for me, that's the first inoculant for disinformation. That if there is more proactive disclosure, and now it's not just an issue of you are a good guy, it is an issue that is required of you by law. The Constitution, Article 35, is already in force. And so when we ask or request for information, you are required within 21 days to have availed that information and or referred to the appropriate agency to respond. Yes, Paul.
I think I absolutely agree that the fundamental issue is access to information. I think as a capital markets regulator, we're often understood. People ask us, why didn't you make sure this investment was good? That's actually not our job. Our job is to make sure you have all the information you need to make a decision for yourself, whether that is the right investment for you. Now, in terms of investment, in information, I actually believe currently the rules and regulations on public disclosures that we have imposed on our market are actually the greatest fodder for you as the media. The level of disclosure of information by companies in Kenya is actually at global standards. When we talk of, we have greatly improved on our doing business standards with respect to the competitiveness issue. One of the biggest drivers of that jump in our competitiveness was the quality of our protection of minority investors because of the quality of information that's out there. As we continuously, there's a new code of corporate governance that has shifted the standard for disclosure to a whole new high. But that standard is about making sure everything investors need to inform that decision is available. But a lot of the pressure we get from our listed companies is all this disclosure is putting us at the mercy of often very skewed interpretation of the information we've made available. It is not a balanced view. You know, even when we go to court, I always find it entertaining reading the papers about our court positions, because each article is based on the reading of one side's pleadings. So today, it will be a clear statement of how right the authority is, and tomorrow, it will be a clear statement of how wrong we are. We have very little reporting that said, this side said this side said this, make your own decision as to that reality. And that's where we need to partner. That's where we need to understand how we're making this information impactful. You know, when we talk to companies and we say, we want to move to sustainability reporting, we want to look at your impact on environmental factors, sustainability factors. They say, okay, we're willing to walk that road, but how is that information going to be used? Is it going to be investors making a determination that, in fact, the direction you're going in is going to support Kenya's long-term sustainable growth, or is it going to be that an errant one reporter will turn it into a 3-day serialization about a very minute area and completely misrepresent the whole big picture? And that's, once again, the partnership we need to build.
So
but I think in closing, I think we need to also accept, as you talk about, is the market shrinking? We need to recognize, as to Njoka's point, right now, because of we have convinced ourselves there's something fundamentally wrong in Kenya, 80% of daily trading volume is foreign, because they are seeing the massive opportunity. They are receiving the public information and seeing the opportunity. But we, locally, are only seeing the downside, and our institutional investors, our retail investors are sitting and waiting till Kenya improves. We have a responsibility to make sure that we have a balanced presentation of what's publicly available so that everyone can enjoy the miraculous transformation that's going on in our country if we'd just not read a paper one day.
Thank you. It is still important to read the papers. But Mwalimu, speak to this issue on how do we move this forward. Many years ago, we were talking about specialized journalists, so that the issue Paul is speaking to, you would have had somebody who was in the same class with him being a journalist, and therefore Paul would not with ease feel that that person is not well endowed to make the right interpretation of issues. But he's also reiterated the issue of balance. I think the very nature of the news cycle here is that no stories are complete. The first beat is today, the next beat will be tomorrow, just to secure some sales in the event that tomorrow is a dry day.
Yes, I think Paul is right that sometimes there's very little balance on the stories that we do, and maybe what that is anchored on is probably, let's face it, sometimes lack of capacity in the media houses. When you begin to look at most of the issues that we are talking about, what do we have desks across the board on these issues? So you may have a desk certainly well established with regard to business, but how packaged are the folks who are doing business? And I think business is one of the better developed bits that we have. But life is more than business. And what about those other areas? I hold this brief that religion plays a very important role in a nation's life. And I think today you can say in Kenya we don't have anybody with the capacity to cover religion. What can we say of other fields, culture, and all the other things that we need to face? So I think building the capacity so that the media houses have got enough and have got coverage of all the necessary bits that we have in the country is really important. And how can we develop our capacity to do that? But I think we should take advantage of the proliferation of media. Media is culture now, I think it's safe to say. And what are all those outlets to which we can deposit content that will be able to address some of the issues that we need? And what's the responsibility from an education point of view on the public so that they can be able to seek information in the right platforms, that information is being made available? What's available on the website, for example, of the capital markets? What's available on every one of these areas to which individuals can then access so that this extension that has become part of us, and we're thinking about social media. I think the government is doing a lot of, putting a lot of investment in terms of spreading broadband across the country so that people, even in the far-flung regions through the last mile outreach in the Universal Service Fund outreach, is making it possible to access content in areas that probably previously were not reachable. How much does the average public individual know that they can access these platforms to access this information? And I think we need to emphasize that.
Thank you. Mr. Mushai? We had one or two questions packed, but you can pick any of those to end with.
Thanks. I'll just address the issue of competitiveness because the question you asked me on productivity, actually Mr. Nzioka answered. He mentioned part of my answer. I don't know, it was telepathic, but it's about, when you talked about the apparels, you're asking me about why highly educated people are not paid as much. But it's all about productivity. And I think our friend here, Edward, was asking about competitiveness. For KAM, for instance, our tagline is inspiring global competitiveness. Whatever we manufacture must be competitive at a global scale. And that means individually, as employees, as workers, we must also have people who are competitive globally. A simple example is our Kenyan brothers and sisters who go to America and they are now, you'll find they are waitering or waitressing or working in a hotel or even taking care of people. But how much are they paid? They are paid a lot more than we are paid here. But I'll tell you why. If you go out here to lunch and see the ratio of waiters to tables is probably twice what they will be doing. Out there, they work to the bone. So it is the productivity. I saw a Starbucks once, which is, say, the equivalent of our Java, and it's manned by 3 people. And they are serving coffee continuously. So obviously, they're going to be paid more. If we have to pay 10 people, including a cashier, just to serve the same amount of coffee, that reduces our productivity. So really what we need to do is look at our productivity. And I think Mr. Nzioka also mentioned the TVET thing, matching people to skills. So I'm guessing we have a lot of journalists here. There are a lot of MAs in journalism. In my factory, you won't find a job. You are highly educated, yes. And I think the prof mentioned what jobs you could do, but not in our place. Then finally, just to mention on the mangoes.
Yes.
You're asking me about the price of agricultural produce. And that is a key point because it links 2 parts of the Big 4 agenda, agriculture and manufacturing. But what we really need to look at is that when we talk about expanding manufacturing, yes, we can do and supply local markets. What we can make and supply local markets is great. But really, where you make a step change is when you begin to export. when you begin to make for the world. So for instance, you mentioned mango prices, etc. But you know, like French beans, we are growing French beans at a phenomenal rate, and you don't hear farmers talking about the price of French beans has gone down or whatnot, because we are supplying a market whose demand is up there. But if you're doing like milk, you mentioned milk again. Unfortunately for us in Kenya, we only make milk for ourselves. So it is only milk we are circulating among ourselves. And that's a finite market. If we had export markets, the price of milk could keep going based on the production. If you take a country like Germany, if you buy a German suit or German-made clothes, you know you're going to pay a serious, serious premium. Even people in Germany don't buy their German-made clothes. But I'll tell you, anywhere in the world, whatever you're buying, if you buy a ball bearing, it is probably German. Okay? They are the world's leading guys on those. So what we need to find is, what do we make that is unique and the world wants and demands from us, and nobody else can make it better than us? And that's how we gain an economic advantage or a trade market advantage and can grow our competitiveness. And finally, just to add on the TVET issue, why it's a big national issue, and I think also for media, talking about productivity and all these things is about how do we express these issues. We always talk about the people who went to university, but if we take from standard 1, 1,200,000 people get into standard 1. At university level, I think we are getting to 80, 100,000. Where are the other people? So we might be talking about these guys, we can give them better jobs, but where are these other guys? And we need to give them jobs as well, because they are Kenyans too. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to thank the panelists. We know that we've just scratched this topic. What I take from this are the promises that we can continue to engage with each other. We can discuss these issues. We can partner so that we are more informed, and everything we do it slightly better. But 2, that there's going to be as much proactive disclosure from the government agencies. And 3, that where journalists are required to write stories, they will not have those standing lines that efforts to reach Nzioka were futile, but our sources in the office indicated this. That line will not be a holder of space, that we would have put in information requests in advance so that we can say in the story he did not respond to the question, as opposed to our other sources indicate this. So allow me once again to thank you very much and appreciate our inadequacies, because we were only step-in moderators for this because Dr. Oranga wasn't there. Asante sana and bon appetit.
Yeah, so back again. Thank you so much, Mr. Henry. Thank you, our panelists, for the great discussion. I mean, this is the time you give a standing ovation. Come on, people. This is a standing ovation. This is the big fall. So, do you want us to do the canoe way or just one big one and then we roll it? Theo? Yeah? Them Tisia one, that's what he's saying. So, this is how we are going to do it. We are going to prepare, the way they do it in church. To ipambe, to ipeleke around, then we are going to clap one and give it to them and we say thank you. Sio? So we ready? Let's go, let's start, let's stretch a little bit. Ipambe kidogo, ipatie maua, chukua upepo kidogo pale, some lightning there. Let's go, 1, 2, 3. Let's go. Thank you so much.